I'm excited to chat with you because not only did we get to speak together at the recent Senate roundtable on chronic disease and nutrition in America, but you are one of the ringleaders, if not the ringleader, behind the recent Kellogg's boycott. So I want to know all about that, the intentions behind this movement, which I think is important.
Yep.
And how you came to this place, because you have a background, in the food industry. You're a major investor in that space and the wellness space as well. But yeah, let's just start.
Would it be helpful if I gave background as to how I even got in the health and wellness space, or should we just go right into Kellogg's?
Well, let's circle back to that.
Fine.
Let's go back. So what's going on with Kellogg's right now?
Okay, so I was a professional investor for 21 years. I did a fair amount of what's called activism, where you actually use both the law and shareholder rights to try to get companies to change their behavior. There's some well-known activists. Bill Ackman's probably the most famous activist. And I have known Vani Hari, who's known as the Food Babe, for probably a decade. And just through all the stuff I did with Hugh Chocolate, when I was a hedge fund manager and I was spending a lot of time on public companies, Vani was the one who in 2014 clued me into the fact that these companies formulate a completely different version of their products in other countries than they have here. And I didn't know that back in 2014. And this was something that became kind of a pet peeve of mine. I gave a presentation on it in 2014 to a bunch of investors. The investors didn't actually care. They thought it was like shocking, but they didn't actually care. And then fast forward, 10 years, in February of this year, Kellogg's made the news because the CEO came out on TV, and they also did a commercial where they were trying to get American families to eat cereal for dinner.
I remember that.
And they actually, and you should put this in your show notes, they actually made an ad that looks like a Saturday Night Live sketch where Tony the Tiger comes into, and it's like a cartoon in a regular human life superimposed scene, where it's like a family at a dinner table and Tony the Tiger comes in and he basically says, "Give chicken the night off, you're going to eat Frosted Flakes for dinner." And it's a real commercial.
Wow.
And then Gary Pilnick, the CEO of Kellogg's, gets on CNBC and starts explaining how food inflation is so high and it's really hard for American families to eat right now. And a bowl of cereal is actually only like $1.50 a person. And so you should eat cereal for dinner.
Wow.
And when I saw that as a food activist, as a father of two, I was just like, that's it. Like, I lost it. I was so, I lost my mind. And a friend of mine is a pretty loud, vocal, famous attorney named Alex Spiro. He's actually Elon's lawyer. And I was having coffee with Alex, and I was explaining to him how fed up I was with all this shit and how toxic, and he knows about what we're doing at Human Co. And he said to me, he goes, "Jason, why don't we write a letter? Like, you should make this a public issue, and you should like use some of what you have done in the past to try to like see if you can get some change." I said, "You're right." And I called up Vani and I called up Callie Means. Callie had become a recent friend. And I said to them, "I'm going to write an activist letter. It's not technically like a lawsuit, but it's the beginnings of a lawsuit. And we're going to make it public, and we're going to basically call out Kellogg's for both, deceptive trade practices, but also the fact that Vani's been harping on for quite a long time, that in 2015, Kellogg's actually came out and they said they're going to get rid of food dyes. And then in 2018, they quietly, and they had like a pledge and it was on their website, and then they quietly removed the pledge. And they started making new cereals that were targeting toddlers with artificial food dyes. And for those I'm sure your listeners are now aware of the issues of food dyes, but there's over 80 peer-reviewed papers on food dyes being neurotoxic, on creating behavioral issues in children, learning issues in children. And then Kellogg's also uses a preservative called BHT, butyl hydroxytoluene, that's actually known to be an endocrine disruptor and also carcinogenic. And they don't use those in all these other countries. And so I got Callie and Vani's input, and I wrote this letter, and it basically laid out that Kellogg should serve the safest, best version of a cereal that they already make in this country. because they sell a better, cleaner version that doesn't have the artificial food dyes. It uses colorants derived from fruit, and it has no BHT. They sell it in Canada. They sell it in Europe. They sell it in Australia. They sell it in India and parts of Asia. And so the thesis was really simple, which is why don't Americans get the safest version of something you already make? And that was in March. And we sent the letter. We publicized the letter on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Instagram. And we got a response back. And they said, we requested a meeting. And it was a pretty benign letter. Like, it wasn't, the letter absolutely could have been construed. It's online if your listeners want to see it. But it was an invitation to sit down and meet with them, because Vani in the past has also, she's called out companies like Kraft and Subway for using these chemicals that are unnecessary. And those companies were willing to meet with her. And we were basically requesting a meeting to say, like, hey, we want to help you honor this pledge and clean up your food. And they wrote back and they said, we don't want to talk about Kellogg's. We want to talk about the whole industry. And we want to bring the head of the Consumer Brands Association, which is the main food lobby for all of these big companies. And we want to debate the science. And so I wrote back, we don't need to debate the science. There's over 80 peer-reviewed papers. Like, yes, and we can get into the bullshit of why scientists are claiming that it's fine. But they basically are relying on this notion that the, quote, totality of the evidence is not conclusive. So they acknowledge that there are, children that have issues, and they acknowledge that there's all these papers. They're not denying that. And they actually, in 2007, which is when like a bunch of these papers started coming out, Europe started after 2007. Europe started creating these regulations where they required either cigarette-like warning labels on the front of a box that says, like, this product can impair your child's behavior and learning abilities, or in some cases they ban these ingredients.
Yeah.
And so these food companies like Kellogg's actually changed the formulations all over the world because they didn't want to have cigarette-like warning labels. And so that was a clear acknowledgement that they know that their food is, A, not the best, and B, can be changed. And so they wanted to meet with us under those ridiculous conditions. And when we wrote back, no, we want to talk about Kellogg specifically, and we don't need to debate the science, and we don't need your food lobbyists in there. They wrote back, nah, never mind, we're not going to meet. And with some bullshit, boilerplate lawyer letter that said, we are using food dyes because of consumer preferences, and we will continue doing what we're doing as long as it complies with applicable laws and regulations. And that was like, there were a few back and forths. That was probably May, June timeframe. And then the issue kind of went quiet for a couple months. And then you and I got invited to the Senate roundtable. And when we got invited to that, Callie called me up, and it was sponsored by Senator Ron Johnson, as you know. And he's like, what do you want to talk about? And I said, well, I think Vani and I should probably talk about this issue, because I still think most Americans aren't aware of it. I think this is an issue that creates outrage in any parents who are aware that they sell a totally better, safer version across the border for the same price, by the way. And Vani and I coordinated like a tag team testimony. So she gave the background on all the different foods that are different in each country versus here. And then I gave the part about how I wrote this letter, and they're not doing anything about it because it's technically legal. And then the scene where I held up the 2 bags of cereal, that became like a viral...
That was a pinnacle moment.
That became like a viral moment, and we didn't even plan that. And the whole line that I had about cocaine versus sugar, that was not planned. My wife was actually really upset with me for saying that at the time, and I'm like, it's fine. And it turned out that was the line that I think people really resonated with.
Wow.
And so that happened, and then it went viral. And then we had a lot of members of Congress. We had people from various states. We had all sorts of people come out of the woodwork reaching out to me and Vani and saying, what can we do? This is crazy. And then Vani had a petition that she had created years ago for concerned American citizens who basically wanted to put their name down on the petition to say, we don't want this shit in our food. And petitions can be effective because it shows the manufacturer that they have a lot of customers that don't want this. And we're going into the Senate panel, we had just under 100,000 signatures. And coming out of the Senate panel like 3 weeks later, we had 400,000 signatures.
Wow.
And at 400,000, it officially makes it the largest petition in food history. And we took those 400, it was eventually got to 450,000. We took those 400,000 petitions and sent Kellogg's a letter that we were going to come to their headquarters in Battle Creek, Michigan. And we want to sit down with them and talk again with them, hopefully not with the Consumer Brands Association, about changing. And 1,000 people showed up for that. And people brought their children. There were over 70 children there during a school day, by the way. And we got there, and we had this great rally, and I'm sure you saw some of the content. There were a lot of health and wellness thought leaders who showed up for that. Dr. Will Cole was there. Dr. Josh Axe was there. Vonnie and I, of course, were there. Callie was there. There were a lot of people there. Alex Clark was there. So we had Courtney Swan. A lot of our people from our panel were there. And then we show up at the door of Kellogg's, and there was 2 security guards that were clearly not employees of Kellogg's. And they said, no one's allowed in today. We'll take your petitions, and leadership will get back to you. Wow. And all of this was filmed. And they handled it in such a disgusting way that we could see that there were like a bunch of executives in the building looking out on us. We were all outside. You should replay some of these clips in your cuts. And then somebody made the horrifically stupid mistake of writing "Get off of our lawn" on like their rolling whiteboard and put it in the window. And we captured that on video. And that just outraged everybody. And then the kids were like, some of the kids were crying. Like it was like crazy. And then I don't know how this happened. They just started singing the Star Spangled Banner. The whole crowd, like just to honor America. And then the press really picked that up.
I mean, it really is the most American thing ever. It reminds me of that Margaret Mead quote: "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world, because it's the only thing that ever has."
Yeah.
And
and so that happened. And then this, well, I guess you would call it a cancel Kellogg's movement started the day after that, where it became almost a national conversation immediately. And then on the heels of the Senate panel 2 weeks earlier, that was when Bobby Kennedy started talking about food dyes, was after our panel, and making that an issue. And I think we've learned a lot about what was taken out of context from that. You know, I think a lot of people have said, like, food dyes in the grand scheme of things aren't that bad. Like, why are you picking on that instead of just ultra-processed food in general? Or why don't you pick on sugar? Or why don't you pick whatever? And it wasn't about the food dyes. Like, I think the food dyes are, yes, they're toxic. I don't think, like, if we pull food dyes out of American food, everyone's going to get better. But I think it's a symptom of a much larger problem, which is what I addressed in my Senate testimony, which is that the U.S. has a corrupt regulatory standard where any company with their own independent experts can bring forth a new chemical that has never been tested on human beings. If they have a bunch of independent experts that say, this is safe, the FDA just rubber stamps it. And that's how trans fats shows up, and that's how Olestra shows up, and that's how this shit shows up. And I think that we wanted to choose, and why I wrote the letter was I wanted to choose an issue that was unassailable. I wanted to choose an issue that there's no argument against it other than it makes the product visually more appealing for children. They already have another way to do it with fruit colorants that we know are safe, and there's no argument. And so this is just like a patently stupid thing where, and I presented to the Texas Senate last week, where the state of Texas is now concerned about this. The state of California, when we did our Senate panel, actually banned 6 different artificial food dyes in public schools, which was like the first state to do that. And now Vonnie and I have been in touch with multiple states. So multiple states are now looking into this. Multiple attorneys general are looking into this. Like, this has become a big thing. And then today, coincidentally, with our podcast, it was in the Wall Street Journal today, and the headline was how Fruit Loops became basically national conversation. So it's become this like groundswell that I don't think we anticipated was going to be this big, but it creates such outrage in people that like they make a better version of something and we don't have that choice. And then the other thing that's critical is that a lot of people, particularly health and wellness influencers, have written on social media, just don't eat Fruit Loops. Just don't eat processed cereal. It's garbage. And what those people miss is that these are in public schools. These are in public hospitals. These are in the military. And in public schools, particularly the lower socioeconomic kids, they don't have a choice. And this is where they get their calories every day. This is what they eat. And so they don't have a choice. And if they're presented with like a bowl of carrots or a bright, shiny box of Fruit Loops, these kids are going to pick the Fruit Loops. And so I think this is actually a much bigger issue where it does need some regulation because these companies have too much of a profit motive to use the artificial food dyes because it cheapens the product for them, so they have higher margins, and it makes it more visually appealing.
Yeah, and I love that you said that this is symbolic of the larger issue that food companies will essentially do whatever they can get away with so long as it's legal, right, under the guise of legality, but that their real motive is to increase profits, to increase shareholder value.
Yeah.
At the expense of public health.
Yes.
If need be.
Yes. I think it's one of the kind of downstream problems of capitalism in this country. And it's actually not consistent across countries, which is interesting. Countries like France and Italy have tremendous respect for farmers. They have tremendous respect for the integrity of food. If you go back 40, 50 years ago, France and Italy used to spend the same percentage of their paycheck, so everyone's paycheck, they used to spend the same percentage of their paycheck as Americans did on food. Today, we spend half of what they spend as a percentage of their paycheck. We spend half on food as they do. So they prioritize better food much more so than we do. They actually have disdain for really cheap food. And they just don't eat it. They think it's gross. Several of these countries have banned, the fake synthetic meat, lab-based meat. They just ban it completely because they don't need to wait for the studies. And the issue that I brought up in the beginning of the Senate panel, which I think is totally throwing this conversation into the wrong direction, is we've become, as a culture, we have become so obsessed with pure science that we have lost our North Star on common sense. And what I mean by that is the critics that we've had and the critics that I see on various channels of media will say the data is not conclusive. You need more studies. You're a pseudoscientist. You can't make that claim, Jason. You don't have a PhD, MD at the end of your name. So therefore, you can't talk about this. And what I said in the Senate panel is, we don't need 10 years of controlled studies to know that we shouldn't have plastic in our brain. Like, we don't need to study for that. Like, we don't need studies to know we shouldn't be giving our kids ingredients that are derived from petroleum or coal tar. Those are not foods. And the conversation in the last 10, 15 years, because of the advent of modern science, has shifted to, if it can't be proven, it must be okay. Or if it can't be measured, then it's not real. And there's so many things that are hard to measure, but it doesn't mean it's not real. And we can go into that because that's like a big pet issue for me. But with this one particular topic, like, Europe takes this stance on their regulation of chemicals that's called the precautionary principle, where they assume that if you're going to introduce something that's a non-food into the food supply, where their citizens have to eat it, they presume that it's guilty until it can be proven innocent with a lot of research. So sometimes it can take up to 10 years. And they put that on the companies to say, you have to prove to us that you can introduce this. America, by complete contrast, uses the GRAS principle, the generally recognized as safe principle, where it's innocent until proven guilty. So they have a bunch of their own scientists that are like put the stamp on it and say, this is safe. And then we find out 10 years later, like, oh, wait, people are dying. People are getting this. People are getting that. And I believe, and this is what I hope Bobby Kennedy and all the people involved in the new administration are going to do, is that we should adopt, it's called a do no harm approach that Europe uses, where if we want to introduce something that's never been eaten in human history, it should be subjected to a lot of studies before it's introduced. Seems pretty logical, but there's a lot of opponents to that because they think it stifles innovation. They think it's over-regulating. And in some instances, I've heard that we think European countries are kind of like not as smart as we are. And I reminded the senator in the panel, like some of these countries we trust enough to have nuclear weapons. So I think we can trust their standards. And what I had suggested is that we just take their approach. And I think I can't quantify it. I don't know how much it's going to help us, but I do know that European citizens live between 5 and 7 years longer than we do. I know that they have far less chronic disease, they have far less obesity, they have far less heart disease, their mental health is significantly better, and they spend between a third and half on healthcare than we do. They're winning in every variable that matters. So I just know that we will be better off as a society if we just don't allow things that are known to be toxic in our food supply until it's gone under absurd amounts of testing.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, success leaves clues. The fact that they spend that they spend a fraction of what we do on healthcare costs, and yet their health is orders of magnitude better.
Yeah.
Across pretty much any metric that you look at.
Yeah, and they smoke, by the way.
And they smoke.
They live longer than us, and they smoke.
Wow.
Yeah. So like, they're winning everywhere.
The pushback that I've seen is incredibly frustrating. They try to make the Make America Healthy Again movement all about red dye 40 now. They basically like straw man the entire movement.
Yes, they're trying to make it like it's just about that.
Yeah.
And it's not. That's a symptom. That's one symptom of the problem. And I think it's the tip of the iceberg. And what I've said is we're starting with food dyes because there's no argument against it. And then we're going to systematically go through the other things. And we started with Kellogg's because Kellogg's, in my opinion, is the worst and most flagrant violator of not caring about what their consumers think. Like, they are pure profiteering, just want to make money, like the big FU to children. And we want to start with Kellogg's. And then actually Friday, Vonnie sent a letter to General Mills. And amazingly, because of all this movement, General Mills wrote right back.
Wow.
They wrote right back. They want to meet. They have some questions. And then they actually put in the paper yesterday, this is only 4 days after the letter, they put in the paper yesterday that they're going to be talking with regulators on complying with whatever the new administration wants.
Wow.
So it's working.
Yeah.
It's working.
That's amazing. And, critics will say, well, you take the red dye out of Fruit Loops and, it's not going to make cereal suddenly
No, it's still shit.
a health food. Yeah. But that's not the argument that you're making. That's
It's like comparing, like, that's like saying, like, heroin with fentanyl is the same as heroin. Like, of course they're both bad, but you'd rather the one without fentanyl.
Yeah, of course. Wow. It is that's crazy. Yeah. I mean, so they're adding these artificial dyes largely, primarily because they can get away with it.
The history's crazy, by the way, about where artificial food dyes come from.
Where do they come from?
It starts from the Rockefeller days. Yeah, it starts from early oil refinery. So there's so many chemicals, and you can generally tell when you look at an ingredient label. This is not just in food. This is in all, like, personal care. If you see words like butyl or butylated, there's all sorts of words that give you a clue that they're derived from a non-food source like petroleum. And there was, and some of this might be apocryphal because who knows how accurate the history is if you go back 100 years. But from my readings on this, there was a lot of byproduct with original oil refinery. And they wanted to figure out, what can we do with all this byproduct? And they figured out that, we could do all sorts of things with this byproduct. We can make colors out of it, and we can add it to foods, and we can add it to dyes from clothing and all this stuff. And we didn't know. I wouldn't say it was malicious back then, because other than the common sense of we shouldn't be eating petroleum or, coal tar, we didn't know it was as bad as it is. But they basically, an entire petrochemical industry was born to take these byproducts from traditional oil refinery and turn them into things that would become part of consumer products.
Yeah, they could commercialize.
Yeah, and that's what's happened. And what they noticed, which again was not necessarily evil, but what they noticed was as all these food companies started to scale, and a lot of these food companies were small in the 40s and 50s, but that was like the beginning of modern public stocks capitalism. They were like, how do we turn food into something like semiconductors, where you can totally scale it and you can have predictable everything? Because when you extract food or things from nature, it's very variable because it's nature, right? So sometimes it looks like this and sometimes it looks like this. And they said, well, the only way we can do that is if we commoditize and widgetize things that are natural, including animals, by the way. So like, how do we basically turn like the Henry Ford model of the construction and production line? How do we do that with food? Because we figured out how to do it with like all machinery and cars and phones and semiconductors. And they realized that, food colorants that come from fruit are more expensive. They're highly variable. You're subject to weather patterns and crop yields. And if we make it out of petroleum, it's going to be the same every time. And it's going to be cheaper. And it has infinite shelf life. And so all of these goals of improving shelf stability, of getting it all across the country, decreasing price, that continued over the last 30, 40 years in every industry, by the way. That forced all these people to hire scientists and figure out what are synthetic versions of natural things that will improve our bottom line. And that's where this all came from. And they realized that with artificial food dyes and all the weird things that are in food today, those are all synthetic because it's a lot easier and cheaper to deal with than natural versions. And now we're all paying the consequence for it. And now we realize that we shouldn't have done that.
Yeah. Well, it reminds me of the flooding of human society, human culture with plastics.
Same thing.
Back in the 50s, we discovered plastic, and it was this incredible sanitary, highly durable material
Doesn't break like glass.
Doesn't break, yeah. And only now we're starting to realize the way that these various plasticizing chemicals have permeated the environment. They're completely persistent. They persist not just in the environment, but in us.
In us.
Yeah.
In our blood, in our umbilical cords, in the placenta, in your balls. They're everywhere.
Yeah. In breast milk.
Yep.
In our brains. And they have biological effects. Like, they're not inert.
Yes. None of these things are inert. Like, that's the thing that I think the last 20 years has really taught us, is there's no free lunch. And depending on how spiritual you want to go on this podcast, and Casey talked about this on the panel, I believe, and I think this is something that's going to be hard to prove, but there's a totality of evidence that would suggest this is true. And I'll tell you why. Because when I was sick in my 20s, and we're jumping all over the place, but when I was going blind at 23 and I had to figure out how to cure my eye disease, which they told me was incurable, but it obviously wasn't, because I'm here today looking at you. I spent a lot of time studying indigenous tribes and populations of people you would call hunter-gatherers. And there's a lot of information on hunter-gatherers. And thankfully, there's still a lot of peoples all over the world that live in this nomadic ancestral way. And they're everywhere, right? There's some in the Arctic, there's some in South America, there's some in Africa, there's obviously indigenous peoples in America. And when I started doing the research on them, and what they found is if they're truly isolated, like there's no kind of pollution or influence from modern American living. There's no obesity, there's no diabetes, there's no heart disease, and there's no mental health issues. But what's also interesting is they have no ADHD, and they have no allergies, and they have almost zero incidence of autism. And these are people that modern, arrogant Americans would consider to be almost like heathens, because they don't have running water in certain cases. And when you go all over the world and you go to the Arctic, there are indigenous tribes that live on whale blubber. Literally, just meat and blubber, because there's no fruits and vegetables in the Arctic, right? And then you go to places like Africa where you see the Maasai tribe. And the Maasai tribe lives on blood and cow flesh and milk. And then you find tribes that live
Raw
on
milk, no less.
raw milk. And then you find tribes that live on fruits, nuts, seeds, and like more of a vegetarian diet. And the only common thread across all these populations is that they live extremely close to the earth and nature. And everything they do is unprocessed. So if they're killing animals, they're wild animals that are right there. And if they're eating fruits and vegetables and nuts and seeds, they're pulling them literally out of the ground without pesticides, just pure nature. And there's like millions of these people. And we have thousands of years of evidence that they're fine. Now, they, in some instances, and this is what Callie and Casey talked about on the panel, they die of what you would call third world diseases, tuberculosis, or they get an infection and die. And one of the great things of modern medicine is how modern medicine can treat acute issues, things like infections or childbirth complications, or you need a hip replacement. But modern medicine has been an abject failure for chronic diseases, as you know. And so I believe that part of why we have all become so sick is that there is something intrinsically nourishing about nature. And not just eating it, but also our interaction with it, being out in the sun, walking around, community, spending time with each other. These are all ways in which we evolved. And we are in a time today where there has been a fundamental shift in disconnection in everything nature. And so I believe that, and again, this is hard to test, but we do have populations that live that way. And I believe that we will get so much better as a society in terms of how we feel, our mental health, and our fertility, if we get back to aspects of nature and we stop trying to play God in synthetically creating versions of things that we think are fine, and we certainly don't put things into our body that aren't from nature directly.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more, but I mean, you're a brilliant guy. You must have seen pushback from, credentialed academic scientists on social media warning against the so-called appeal to nature fallacy, right?
Yep.
Like arsenic is natural. Some of the most toxic substances on Earth are
Uranium
natural,
is natural.
right? Polio is natural.
Uranium is natural.
Smallpox is natural. Yeah. So how do you then, because you do see that criticism quite a bit.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
So how do you get into the ring with those types?
I mean, I think that those are like straw man common sense arguments, right? Like,
well, I agree.
Yeah. And
it's like you're kind of gaslighting the concerns of mothers and fathers and parents. Like we're not talking about polio. Like nobody wants polio for their children.
Yeah. And by the way, I'm not saying that like modern medicine isn't amazing, and it's amazing for certain things, but I think that a lot of our problems are not solved by what we have to add to ourselves. A lot of our problems will be solved by what we have to remove. And I think if you go back again to these cultures, which in certain ways are actually far more advanced than us. They might not be more advanced than us technologically speaking, but in terms of like their spiritual awareness, in terms of how they like live with nature. Like, I don't know if you've ever spent time on like safari when you have like a tracker. Have you ever seen how these like trackers operate?
No.
This is incredible. Like, and only in the last probably few years has some of this, I guess I would call it more spiritual phenomenon becoming more mainstream in discussion. How there's things that are hard to measure, but you know how like animals can sense things where it's hard for us to explain how they might sense things. And in some cases, they actually believe that animals have elements of telepathy. So they actually did a study. You should look this up. This is crazy. They did a study with dogs where dogs knew when their owners were coming home. And they did a proper scientific study where they actually filmed the dogs, and they took a bunch of owners and they would randomly call them and tell them to go home when they were like out. And as soon as the owners were on their way home, the dogs would come to the front door. And this is like the kind of thing that most scientists would be like, that's impossible. It doesn't work. When you go out into nature and you spend time with these tribes, and we just went to Africa with my family over the summer, and we spent time with a tribe that's cousins of the Maasai called the Samburu. And they have trackers. And these trackers actually know how to like find animals. And they do it without like technology. And we would think of it almost like voodoo. But there are aspects to our, let's just call it sensory apparatus, that we used to use, and we don't use it anymore, and we don't know how it works because we can't explain it. But there's something spiritual about it. And when you spend a lot of time with some of these types of people, they do things that are extraordinary, that are kind of hard to explain in modern science, and we kind of dismiss it because we're like, oh, those are shaman, or those are, hunter-gatherer types. But I think like they've lived a certain way for thousands of years. They know not to eat uranium, right? They know not to eat poisonous plants, and they're thriving. And if like I brought my children, and my children were really surprised because we went and visited some of these villages, and they're, objectively, like they live in dirt. They're very dirty, and they don't have running water, and they have dirt all over them, and they have like flies, and modern Americans would look at that and be like, oh, that's filthy. But they had perfectly white teeth. They're very happy. They're totally healthy, and they're thriving, and they live in dirt. And there's just like a lot of things that I think we have to question, because what we talked about on the panel is we are the most technologically advanced we've ever been today. We have more pharma than we've ever had today. We have more medical devices than we've ever had today. We exercise more than we ever have today. And yet we're the sickest we've ever been. So just objectively, you can look at that and say, what we're doing not only isn't working, it's bad. And we have to realize that our what in epistemological circles they call it your maps of reality, which is sort of the way you think the world works. Our maps of reality are broken, and we have to like literally step back. And it's the quote that Albert Einstein says: the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. We have to step back and say there's aspects of our scientific approach to human health that have made us the sickest we've ever been. So we have to take a step back, and we have to look to some of these other populations. And instead of doing 10-year studies, we can look at these populations and say, even the blue zones, by the way, have a lot of this too. We can look at these populations and say, they're doing something right. There's something to learn from that.
What do you say to people who claim that it's fear-mongering to point out these chemicals in ultra-processed foods? I mean, we all know that ultra-processed foods tend to be the foundation of the epidemic of chronic disease, but that hyper-focusing on specific chemicals is a fear-based approach that can potentially promote, orthorexic eating patterns and things like that.
I say too bad. I say like, meaning there are certain things I don't think you should have in moderation. And I think that argument of like everything in moderation is another gaslighting comment. Like you would never drink a little bit of gasoline in moderation. You'd never abuse your children in moderation. Like there's things that like don't even pass the smell test, right? You'd never like ride a motorcycle without a helmet in moderation. There's certain things. And I think there are, yes, if you eat a little bit of food dyes, is it going to kill you? No. But I think there are things that just should not be in our food supply, period. And what all of these studies, and I've spent a lot of time on these studies, what all these studies don't measure is cumulative compounded effects. And a lot of the regulations that were put in for grass, where we sort of were like, yeah, those are probably safe. Those were put in 50, 60 years ago. And depending on the studies that you look at, we consume anywhere from 500% to 1,000% more of what it was in the 70s. And we never measured the compounded cumulative effects of all this stuff. We don't know what happens if it just keeps building in you for 15, 20 years. And we don't know, like, when you develop cancer, that cancer's been baking in you for a very long time, or the preconditions for the cancer to develop have been baking in you for it's not like one thing that you ate and all of a sudden you have cancer. So I just say that, yes, like I have seen in policy that if you try to appeal to people by just saying like it's healthier to eat this than this, we are instinctive animals. And even though we might hear it, we're still attracted to like the bright, sugary, processed food, because those things are engineered for when humans were in scarcity mode. When we were hunter-gatherers and we would go days without food, and we would come across salt, or we would come across sugar, or we would come across fat. Those were things that our instinctive brain would say, ooh, I need that. And we have not evolved out of that. And so all of these processed food companies have created a way to feed those instinctive elements that we can't turn off because we are still animals. And so I think we have to start somewhere. And I know that you're trying to appeal to people's higher logic doesn't work. We've tried it for 50 years. And so I think by being a little maybe loud about the fact that when you combine all of these non-food foods into somebody's daily diet, the cumulative effects are overwhelming. And I just think like we have to start in a way where the conversation can't be nuanced. We have to just be honest. Like, you should not be eating things that have 80 peer-reviewed papers that are known to be a problem.
Yeah. Yeah, Callie Means talks about the dangers of incrementalism, and how we're really seeing an epidemic of unprecedented proportions, and how you do, maybe it is the time to be brash and to be.
I think it is.
Yeah.
I think it's the time to break status quo. And look, I've had a lot of people since the election. I never wanted this to be a partisan issue. I never wanted this to be about, like, is it a right-wing issue? Is it a Republican issue? Poison should not be partisan. And it really upset me, and I know it upset you, that this became like a thing where they tried to make it like because Maha rhymes with MAGA, they tried to make this like this is a purely Republican thing. This is what they're going to need to elect Trump. They tried to take whatever your opinions of Trump are and like wrap it around all of this. This is pretty simple, which is like we are all brothers and sisters. We are all humans together. And we should not get paid money to poison each other. Like, that's it. And we have a system, which again, all these things, like any horror movie with like the Frankenstein motif, they all start with good intentions. But the capitalist system has rewarded profit growth immensely, and all of these public companies bear none of the societal consequences of what happens to people over 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And
yeah, you get sick, you're on your own.
Yeah. And we're at a point now when, and this is where I completely agree with, some people call what Callie's been saying sensationalist. We are absolutely in an existential crisis. This is the definition of a slow motion apocalypse. Like, if you extrapolate, men's sperm count's down 50% in 40 years. And humans, assuming this part of science is accurate, the first known human was between 250,000 and 300,000 years ago, right? And just in the last 40 years, have we taken this massive steep turn towards where we are in terms of the health epidemic. As a percentage of our evolution, that's like 99.99%. We were like one way. And then just in the last 40 years, out of a time span of 300,000, like, we think that we know what we're doing, and look what happened. And so I think what Callie's been saying in terms of the sensationalism is warranted. Like, I think this is an existential crisis. And then when you add in the cost of it, the $4.5 trillion we're spending on preventable disease, like, we're going to bankrupt our country. And, we are the first generation in recorded human history that is going to live a shorter lifespan than our parents, other than wars. So, like, if this isn't like a biblical warning sign, I don't know what is.
Yeah, I agree. I historically, I've been apolitical, and I would consider myself an independent. But some of the criticism that I've seen to the movement, I really have no. It's difficult for me to refute. So maybe you can speak to it. The notion that Republicans historically have been associated with deregulation, and we're asking for more regulation, right, for the food industry.
Yep.
How do those two ideas get reconciled?
Yeah, it's a good question. That comes up a lot. And I'm very independent. I actually tilt a bit libertarian. But I think, again, because of our capitalist structure where our American society, more than I would say any country, revolves more around money than any other society. And we have evangelized hustle culture. We've evangelized like ambition to the point where, you work 100 hours a week and, you ruin your health, you ruin your family, but you got really rich. And we idolize these people who do that. And I think in this country, because of that, and because everything revolves around capitalism, and I've seen it, having been a public market investor, I've seen how these boardrooms go. And I've seen companies where they've come out and they've said, hey, we want to try to clean up. Like, we want to try to get, there have been multiple companies that have come out in the past and said, we want to try to get rid of food dyes. Or we want to try to move to organic. Or we want to try to move to fair trade practices and not use labor where the children are abused. And what happens every time is when things are great, this happened with PepsiCo also. When Indra Nooyi, who I think is the greatest female CEO of all time, she tried to clean up Pepsi. And there was a period of time where everything was going great at Pepsi and the board was fine with it. And they're like, okay, your little pet project of trying to clean up our food, go ahead. But then all of a sudden, when things inevitably, every company has this, they start to hit like a problem. They start looking at the margins of the ultra-processed garbage food, which is inevitably way higher than the newer, healthier, more organic, more fair trade, more responsible stuff. And the board says, we need more of that, less of that, because we got to make the quarter. Because if they don't make the quarter, the CEO gets fired. And then if they keep missing, the board gets fired. And people are just trying to keep their jobs. And so the whole structure is rigged to try to optimize bottom line. And there is no penalty and there's no reward. There's no penalty for poisoning us, and there's no reward, like explicit reward, for accomplishing some of these other non-financial metrics, like are people happier, are people healthier? And so this is why this keeps happening. And because that structure is so pronounced of capitalism and profit over people, you need to do something as a government where you have to say to these companies, we can't even give you the incentive to do this, right? Because the food dyes are there. And they're legal. So when they're choosing between how do we make our margins better, they're like, oh, well, let's use more of that fake shit because it's legal and our margins will go up. And so I believe that in areas where the profit motive is so strong, we have to regulate it to not allow them to even do it. And again, I don't think most of the time, I don't think it's malice. I think it's simply incentives, incentives, incentives. And that's where I think regulation has to be. And I think when it comes to human health and protecting the citizens from corporations doing something that would harm the citizens, I think regulation is necessary.
Yeah. Well, I think that's the job, that's the role of any well-functioning government, regardless of what, side of the aisle you're on. It's to protect its citizens from harm, from physical harm. And we're now at the point where we understand that these companies are imposing physical harm on the population.
Yeah. Yeah. And we have basically, loaded the gun for them. Our government has given them a loaded gun and all they're doing is pulling the trigger. And we need to stop loading these guns.
Amen. Why don't you share your own personal health journey with us?
Yeah, so I think in some ways my early life for sure is a cautionary tale. And when I speak about the sort of hustle culture and ambition, like I was probably and I say this without, immodesty and without exaggeration, I was probably one of the greatest overachievers you'll ever meet. And I had a totally, unspecial childhood. I had really bad ADHD, undiagnosed. And when I got to college, and I miraculously got into Penn, long story, but I was a competitive tennis player. I was sort of recruited to play in college, and I ended up switching to college squash. But when I got to Penn, something very weird happened where my brain turned on. And I wasn't even in the top 25% of my high school graduating class. And I got to Penn, and I ended up transferring into the Wharton School, which is the number one school in the United States, harder to get into than Harvard. And I had no business being there. And but something weird happened where my brain turned on, and all of a sudden college was really easy for me. Everything I did was just easy. And I just started getting straight A's. I started doing better at the hardest school in the country than I did in high school. And I started, because of a lot of the shit I had in my youth, I had some trauma as a kid, and I had a lot of just chips on my shoulder from always being like an underachiever. I decided to basically develop like this intense ambition, workaholism, and I combined that with my intellect, which was turned on at that point. And I just started like dominating, and I started doing really well. And I ended up graduating third in my class. I was the top student athlete in the whole university. I won like 6 different awards. And I was so obsessed with, I want to get rich. I want to like do something that could like fill all of the holes of my insecurity. And I ended up getting this coveted job out of college where I went to a hedge fund when I was 21 years old. And I just kept applying this sort of workaholism culture, hustle culture attitude, where I was like, I'm going to work 90, 100 hours a week. I'm going to get really rich. And I ended up on the financial side succeeding, and they made me the youngest partner in history. And as this was happening, and I thought like everything was going great, I started falling apart physically. And I started developing all of this psoriasis all over my body, and my hair was falling out in clumps, like in the shower. And I started losing my vision. And I ended up going to a bunch of ophthalmologists, and I finally got diagnosed with a degenerative eye disease, for which there's no cure. And it was so progressed at that point, they said, you have maybe 7 years before you're fully blind, and there's nothing you can do. And I had to put my name on a corneal transplant list, which back then was like 50-50 at best. It might work, it might not work. And this was happening at the same time that my job was like going gangbusters. And I fell into a real dark depression. And I was so ashamed of my health because of, I wanted to look like this hero at work. I didn't even tell my parents how bad it got. And I just had this kind of, I don't know where it came from. You could call it divine. I had this voice in my head that basically said, don't listen to the doctors. Like, you should do your own work. And I was trained as an empirical research scientist. So my job was as what they now call a data scientist originally. I was called, back then it was called like a quantitative research analyst. So to me, everything was like data, and it had to be proven. And I started doing a lot of research, and this is how I discovered the indigenous peoples, and this is how I discovered like the beginnings of the blue zones. And there were some early books on functional medicine back. This is in the year 2000. Mark Hyman had just written a book. Dr. Andrew Weil was kind of this pioneer of integrative and medicine of using nature to heal yourself. And I decided to see if I could try to reverse my diseases with natural ancestral methods. And I mentioned it to a few of my doctors. And by the way, like all these different doctors that I was seeing, they all thought I had different diseases. So they're like, you should take this pill for this disease, you should take this pill for this disease. And again, something in me was like, I'm not taking any pills. Because 2 years ago when I was in college, I was an academic All-American athlete. I was like really healthy. And 2 years later, I'm dying. And no one can figure out what's wrong with me. And so I kind of knew something was wrong in a holistic sense and that everything was connected. And I decided to go on this very restricted diet. I removed, and I was eating like shit, and I was, drinking a lot of caffeine in the morning, eating like, cheeseburgers and fries or hoagies at lunch. We'd go out, I was a single 23-year-old in New York City. We'd go out for drinks like 4 nights a week. I was sleeping, 4 or 5 hours a night, like working my ass off. I wasn't exercising, and I wasn't spending time with people. And I was just like, just all like get ahead. And the doctor said to me when I said, this is what I'm going to do, they're like, that's not going to work. But I started doing it anyway. And I noticed that my skin disease started going away. My hair stopped falling out. And I noticed my vision started coming back. And I went, I did this for probably 5, 6, maybe 7 months. And it felt like my vision was completely back. And I went to the doctor, and thankfully there's an objective test for this eye disease where it's not my own opinion. Like there's a test that says you have the disease or you don't have the disease. And I said to the doctor, I said, I think the disease is gone. Give me the test. And he said, that's impossible, but fine, I'll give you the test because it's a degenerative disease. Gave me the test. It's gone. And I remember hearing him, and I remember hearing the other doctor who was in the room with him. He says, you got to come look at this. And I hear the other guy go, that's impossible. And then the guy comes up to me and he goes, what did you do? And I told him. And he goes, nah. He's like, I must have misdiagnosed you. And he said, well, whatever it is, you don't have the disease. And I walked out of the doctor's office, and you know how you have one of those moments where you remember for the rest of your life, and you're like, my life is going to be forever changed from this moment on. And I walked out of that office, and I thought, I am never going to fully trust Western medicine dogma again. And there was something here that worked. I don't know what it is, but there was something here that worked that came from like my instinct or divine or whatever it is. And I'm going to now devote a significant part of my life to helping people wake up, helping people have agency and control over their own health. And this was going to become a significant part of like my life and my purpose. And I met my wife literally 2 months after I cured myself, who you've met, Jessica. And then a few years later, her brother, Jordan, I was telling him about all the stuff I went through. I gave him a bunch of the books. He started kind of living this way also, which is sort of like a modified paleo ancestral kind of way of living. And he noticed how much better he felt and how much better he looked and how much better he performed. He wasn't sick like I was, but he just was like, everything got better. And he said to me, he said, you know, why don't we create a restaurant that's the manifestation of all these principles that we're doing? And I said to him, I said, Jordan, I said, I'm a professional investor for a living. Restaurants are terrible businesses. We don't know anything about restaurants. No chance. And he convinced me. And through all of our work, we came up with the name Hugh. Hugh started as a restaurant. We came up with the name Hugh because Hugh stands for human. Most people call it who, but it's actually Hugh as in human. And our slogan is get back to human. Because I believed, and I still believe, that part of why we're so sick is that we live at odds with how we have evolved as human beings. And Hugh started as a restaurant in New York City in Union Square. We opened in 2012, the original restaurant, which I believe you went to many times.
Mm-hmm, many times. That's how I met Jordan.
We were seed oil free in 2012. And the whole restaurant, it was extremely restrictive, but the whole restaurant was gluten-free, dairy-free, refined sugar-free. Everything that needed to be organic was organic. All the meats and animal products were wild or from animals that were raised consistent with their evolution. And the chocolate came out of the restaurant, and it was a bit of an accident. But that was what began sort of my connection between business and healing other people. And Hugh became so successful, and I was running my own hedge fund at the time, and I loved the feedback that we got from people who needed Hugh. I mean, we got letters from people that never thought they could eat sweets again. They never thought they could eat chocolate. They never thought they could eat like a piece of pizza. That our pizza was like gluten-free, grain-free, and we had all those baked goods. And we get letters from people that said, like, you changed my life. And I never got letters like that running a hedge fund. And I realized that my higher calling was to help others and to help others heal themselves. And I had another period of depression in 2016 because my business was very successful and very profitable, but I wake up every day and I would feel like I shouldn't be doing this. And I felt like my soul was rotting. And Jessica was kind of begging me to stop. And it was really, really hard because that was my identity. And it was very lucrative. And I had 40 people working for me. It was a very big fund with a very consistent like annuity. And it took a lot of soul searching. It took a lot of depression. It took a lot of therapy. I ended up having to do psychedelic therapy because I had a very unfortunate incident happen where my best friend and business partner of 16 years killed himself. And that put me into a very dark place. And it was a magnified version of what happened to me when I was 23, because on the surface I looked like this successful person, and I had a family, and my health was pretty good at the time, but inside I was rotting. And And I just knew that this was not what I was supposed to do on this planet. And then I ended up, it took me a few years too long, but I ended up coming up with the idea for Human Co., which was to basically create everything I'd ever done in the world and put it all under one roof, where Human Co. is a health and wellness conglomerate or holding company where we buy and build brands and create experiences that allow people to live a healthier life across a variety of different aspects. And I retired from that business. We returned the money to our investors. My family moved to Austin, Texas, and that was the beginning of Human Co., and that was the beginning of the next chapter of my life.
Yeah, and you guys now get behind brands that produce, they're processed foods, but they're foods that are, a healthier, a better for you alternative than what was previously on the market.
Yeah, and I'll tell you why we did that, because a lot of people ask that, right? They say, like, why don't you just make like salads? And what I learned in all my research, and I was on a nutrition school board for 4 years. I spent a lot of time in policy. You can't create change if you try to take people and shift them in a massively dramatic way. You can't get people who eat McDonald's and Domino's every day and get them and start eating like salads and like grass-fed steaks at home. You can't go from there. It'll never happen. You have to meet people where they are. And what I noticed was that comfort foods and junk foods were the worst in terms of the chemicals, the synthetics, the poisons. And so the idea was, if we approach the things that people love and they're used to and they've had for 50 years, things like chocolate, things like cookies, things like pizza, things like ice cream, these are categories that will never go away. And if I could create a much better version of that doesn't have any of the synthetics, any of the poisons, any of the artificial anything, and all of our things are seed oil free, they're very simple ingredients. Most of what we do is organic. If it's not organic, we lab test it. It's all, the cleanest version of that thing. It's still a bit indulgent, like ice cream is still ice cream, but people love ice cream, and I love ice cream. And so my belief was, we will have more of a dent on society by showing people that instead of eating like that garbage Ben and Jerry's, you can have Cosmic Bliss, and it's still amazing ice cream. It's objectively amazing, and it just so happens to be much, much healthier than that. We will have much more dent on society than trying to convince people to stop eating ice cream altogether. And that was the idea behind those initial categories. But in Human Co., we also have a few other areas where one of our big investments is Grove Collaborative. Grove is the #1 marketplace online for non-toxic and anti-plastic household products and personal care. So if you know, like Thrive Market, for more grocery, Grove Collaborative is the place you go if you're like, I want to buy a not plastic version of garbage bags, or I want to have dish soap that doesn't come in a giant plastic bottle. So cleaning up your household, you go to Grove Collaborative, right? It's not food though. True Food Kitchen we recently bought control of, because True Food to me was like a more approachable, larger scalable version of Hugh Kitchen. And I feel that we are in a time now where most restaurants in this country are garbage, and they serve a lot of garbage. And True Food was a place that we had found. It was started in 2008 by Dr. Andrew Weil, where it's basically like an approachable farm to table. And I know you love some of their stuff.
I eat there at least once a week.
Yes. And what I love about True Food, which is different from like a Sweetgreen or a Cava, is most of the growth in the restaurant industry in the last 10 years has been around convenience. It's been around like quick, fast, casual, get it, go eat at your desk. And I believe that we are coming back to a time where we want to spend more time with each other. And we need to have these pockets of oasis where you're just like, I'm going to put my phone down, I'm going to talk to my friend Max, we're going to have 45 minutes. It's not a long meal, but it's not eating at your desk. It's not like grabbing it from the counter and eating it like this. And I think that needs to come back. And I think people are starting to realize that experiences are valuable. And you can see this actually in bookstores. So what's interesting is when I started working, 98, 99, that was the beginning of Amazon. And that was the end of bookstores. And there was a period where like every bookstore went bankrupt because everyone was buying their books on Amazon. The last 2 years are the fastest growth of bookstores in the United States ever.
Wow.
Bookstores are coming back because people want to actually go out again. They don't want to be locked at their desk. And I'm seeing this everywhere. I'm seeing much more interest in experiences because I think people are fed up with being isolated. And we have an epidemic of loneliness. And so one of the things we're going to try to do with True Food over the next 5 years is we're going to stay true to the roots in terms of no seed oils, farm to table, everything clean. But there's always going to be comfort foods that you can recognize, like a grass-fed cheeseburger. There's an amazing chicken parm now that's air-fried, no seed oils, gluten-free chicken parm.
My favorite dish is the lasagna.
The lasagna's amazing.
I'm obsessed.
The lasagna's amazing. But we want to show people that you can still have amazing food and you don't need any of the synthetic garbage. And so that's the essence of what we're trying to do across all of HumanCo, is just create a variety of things where you as the consumer, you know me, you know HumanCo, you know that if I'm going to put my name on it, it's going to have these attributes, and you don't have to be skeptical, and you don't have to go like, who's behind this? What's their profit motive? Why are they doing this? And that's what I think right now we're starting to see with this new administration and with all of the MAHA momentum. I think people are voting and saying, we're sick, like, pun intended, we're sick of all these companies not caring about us. And our main mantra at HumanCo is people before profit. And I think it's possible to do both.
Well, you're not just sending an incredibly important message to consumers. You're sending a really important message to the food industry, that this can actually be profitable, that you can actually, clean up your ingredient profile, and you don't necessarily have to, saturate your foods with whatever you can, get away with to increase the profit margin. And it'll actually, like, consumers will reward you as a result. I mean, you sold your chocolate bar line to Mondelez, right?
Yep. We could talk about that because some people mistakenly think about, like, oh, you sold your chocolate company to a big food company. And
that's never bothered me, but yeah, a lot of people on
let me
social
explain
media.
that, because this has happened. It just happened with Siete, who sold to PepsiCo.
Primal Kitchen also was
Primal Kitchen
a couple
sold
years
to
ago.
Kraft Heinz.
Yeah.
So what's really important is, in the past, when large food companies have bought or acquired a stake in healthier or responsible food companies, in the past, like you go back 20, 30 years ago, they totally destroyed the ingredients. They cheapened the shit out of it. They made it garbage, and they ruined it. And they tried to pretend like it was a family-owned business. That did happen. Consumers got wise to that. And so what started happening was some of these big food companies realized that they need to keep the integrity, or else the brand just gets ruined. So there's actually a financial reason why they don't want to mess with it. When we were evaluating selling our company, and it wasn't for sale. This is all public, and I can talk about this, but there's parts I can't talk about. But we had Mondelez was a small shareholder of Hugh. They were on our board. We had originally taken them as a small shareholder because some of what Mondelez was doing we thought was really good for big food companies. They were buying some healthier companies. They bought Perfect Bar. They bought Tate's Cookies. They were trying to get healthier. Mondelez also makes Oreos. They make Cadbury. They have plenty of stuff that is not good from a health perspective. But I liked their approach. And we knew as a small company that we didn't know how to expand internationally. They did. We didn't know how to reach a lot of people the way that they did. They had massive distribution. And part of our negotiation was they can't change the ingredients. And I don't think they will, but they can't. And they purchased it in 2021, and we're now in November of 2024, and it is exactly the same product as when we sold it. And there are millions of people now that have been able to have Hugh chocolate that weren't able to have it in 2021. And so instead of them eating Cadbury or Hershey's, they're now eating Hugh. And so we were able to reach a lot more people. Now, some people would say, like, oh, you sold out, you're helping like big food. And yeah, you could argue that, but part of my approach was I want more, even if it doesn't affect me financially, I want as many companies that are doing right for humans to exist. And I want them to be profitable, and I want them to like survive. And if they don't survive, you can't change anything.
Well, it gives a lot of hope to like upstart,
Yeah.
like entrepreneurs.
And you want to encourage people to do things the right way instead of doing
course.
things the wrong way.
Of course. Yeah, I think it's amazing. I sent you a photo. I was in London last year, and I saw a massive display of Hugh Kitchen chocolate bars at the.
Yeah, it does very well in London.
Yeah,
and it's international now. It's in many countries now.
I was so proud.
Yeah. So, but we learned a lot from that. We learned a lot dealing with these big companies and what they think about, and they know the problem that these big food companies have is they know where the puck is going. They know they have to have some healthier options. The problem is, and it comes back to the whole capitalist public markets thing, they make, like you take a company like Mars, which is a private company, but still it's one of the biggest food companies in the world. Mars makes, they don't disclose it, but it's probably between $5 and $8 billion a year on M&Ms and stickers alone. Just those. Those are the things, and if you look at Pepsi, right, you look at Coca-Cola, like Pepsi probably makes, they own Frito-Lay, which is Doritos, they probably make 100 times on Doritos of what they're going to make on Siete, right? So they know they have to get into like healthier chips, but they can't upset where their bread is buttered. And so it's really hard for them to pivot because they don't want to cannibalize where like their golden goose is. And so it's really hard for these big food companies to switch because they have these brands that are 50 years old and they can't like turn them off. And that's why I believe you need to have some of these newer companies because they don't have the legacy problem of like having shareholders having some garbage product that makes them all their profit. And so the new companies don't have that problem.
Well, so circling back to like Kellogg's, right? How then, like what is the expectation then for a company like Kellogg's with a hero product like Fruit Loops?
Yes.
Like how likely is it that they're going to change the formula on a product for them that is their cash cow? Or, I mean, one of many, one of a handful of cash cows that they have.
Not voluntarily. So there's two ways that I think they're going to be forced to change. I think one is top down, which is regulation, government. California, as an example, if 6 big states did what California did, Kellogg's would change. Because they're not going to create a different version of Fruit Loops for 6 states and then a different version for the other. Because it's just, A, it's logistically difficult, and B, like, they just looks ridiculous if people find out about that. The other way is the bottom up. And I was hoping from our Senate panel, and it's starting to happen, where consumers boycott the product. And if you have, for these low growth companies like Kellogg's, if you have a 5%, 10% drop in their sales, they'll change overnight. And if everyone who's listening to this tells every single person that they know to never buy Kellogg's again, they will change. Because the invisible hand of economics is very powerful. And ultimately, they are doing what makes the money. And if selling synthetic garbage doesn't make the money, they're going to have to change, or else they're going to go bankrupt.
Amen. Well, I'm grateful to be boots on the ground with you in this fight.
It's been fun.
Yeah, it's been so fun. I don't know what's next, but I think, I'm optimistic. I have no idea how things are going to shake out over the next 4 years, but I think Bobby, his heart's in the right place. I love his conviction, his passion. He seems to be surrounding himself with the right people, and yeah, we just got to keep pushing the stone.
Yeah. Look, I think what some people have said is it's going to be very messy and it's going to be very sloppy. And it might be. But I think we need it. Like, I'm okay with that volatility. I'm sure they're going to do some things where we don't realize, like, oh, wow, we shouldn't have done it that way in terms of changing the system. But we need it. I think the incrementalist approach that you mentioned that Callie's against will not work. And I think we need to break some China, and I think we need to totally disrupt the status quo. And it is going to have a lot of collateral damage. And I think we all, as citizens, have to be okay with that when you're in an existential crisis and you desperately need to change.
Yeah. Well, you want to make an omelet, you got to break a few eggs.
There you go.
So, Jason Karp, thanks for coming out. I got one last question for you before we get to that. Where can people find you on social media? How can they support your work and your efforts and, everything in between?
My social handles is human Karp, HUMANKARP. And humanco.com, you can learn more about all the things we do at Humanco. True Food Kitchen is in 17 states, and you're going to see some good changes at True Food over the next few years. But yeah, I'm spending a lot of time on activism lately because it seems to be effective. And like you, I'm very optimistic. And I said to my wife, probably a couple weeks ago, this is the first time I've been optimistic in 15 years. Because I've been in this for a long time, and I've just seen the bowels of how corrupt the big food system is. And to have these topics be national conversation is so encouraging, because it's the kind of thing that when you open your eyes, you can't close them again. And so once people realize, like, wow, I don't want to feed my kids that shit, it changes. And so I'm very optimistic, and I'm grateful to people like you spreading the word about how we can all live a better life.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. I haven't felt this optimistic in a long time. Well, the last question that gets asked everybody on the show, what does living a genius life mean to you?
I think living a genius life to me means being able to be on your deathbed and look back and say, I have no regrets. And for me, I realized many years ago after my bout of depression that we are all here to serve, and we are all here to serve others. And every human will find that they will be happier and more fulfilled in their life if they devote some of their time to service. Both for helping humanity as well as helping the planet. And so I think it's something that in this time of loneliness and isolation, and we're also at a peak time of selfishness, I think we have to go back to the fact that we are social creatures, and we should devote a significant amount of our time to making the world a better place.
Couldn't have said it better. Beautiful. Well, thanks again, brother. Hey, if you liked that video, you need to check out this one here, and I'll see you there.